Hello, everyone, and welcome to part one of our lecture on Chapter 16 Future Trends in Counseling Assessment. So, up until this point, a lot of our conversations about assessment are around protocols and assessments that are available to you, and really the variety of assessments that you can use. And for Chapter 16, we're really going to focus on where we go from here. Now that we have this information and now that we have established sort of a base of knowledge of assessment, where do we expect the field to continue moving in the future? So let's start by looking back. So, looking back at the different types of assessments that have been used over the past 150 plus years and how they have been used can be really helpful in us determining how assessments will be used in the future. We really have to look at the ways that assessment has been helpful as well as harmful in the past so that in the future we know what direction to move in next. It's also important to keep in mind that the purpose of assessment throughout time has been to facilitate decision making and client and counselor knowledge, awareness, and skills. So, assessment has always been this tool that's around helping us connect with our clients so that we can build knowledge, awareness, and skills both for ourselves as clinicians and for our clients, and so that the clients can use that information to inform their decision making process. And assessment tools have been used for screening, accountability, as well as resource allocation purposes, just to name a few. We've seen many purposes of assessment over the last 15 chapters. And despite the benefits of assessment, we do see that there's a general downward trend in assessment usage right now. Overall, there are fewer people who are using assessments, and there are fewer instances where assessments have been needed. And this downward trend in assessment must be addressed to protect the viability of conducting assessments in the future. There are various reasons why we see this downward trend in assessment. For example, we might see this decreased use due to limited attention to assessment and training programs. There aren't very many programs that are offering comprehensive assessment training procedures to students at both the PhD and the master's level. We also see that there's an erosion of healthcare reimbursement. Not every clinician who is engaging in assessment is getting reimbursed for the work that they're doing, which then of course makes it so that people don't want to do assessments because they want to get paid for the work that they're doing. We also see that assessments take a lot of time and resources. And because they take a lot of time and resources, people tend to shy away from them because they don't want to waste very important time doing something that might not be fruitful, especially if they're also not guaranteed to get paid for their work. We also see that professionals' limited knowledge of the assessment process is leading to a lot of this decreased downward trend, where if people don't know what assessments are out there, don't know how to use them, then they're not likely to take the time to learn how to do them. And we also see that there's insufficient advocacy of the assessment process, as well as insufficient advocacy and promotion of the utility of assessment in the counseling process to the external stakeholders. So to insurance companies, to the test makers, to the companies that are paying the bills for these clinicians, there isn't enough advocacy in those settings to warrant the continued use of assessment. And looking ahead, even with this downward trend, counselors, no matter the extent to which they believe they will do assessment, will have to attend to trends in assessment usage as part of sustaining their professional identity and livelihood. And one of those trends relates to client demographics. So, as our society continues evolving and aging, we've seen and we continue to see that the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States population will continue to diversify. And the overall population of individuals born outside of the United States will increase by 6% by the year 2060. Also, the US population is getting proportionately older, in that we're seeing a lot of people who are living much longer in their lives, and we're also seeing an increase in we're also seeing the socioeconomic statuses will likely remain as a significant influence on client incomes. These changing demographics will require alterations in the assessment process and tools themselves to promote optimal counseling and assessment experiences for an increasingly diverse clientele. Furthermore, social justice practices in counseling will continue to inform practices in assessment. Counselors will need to remain open to new ways of thinking to best support culturally diverse clients who experience oppression. Also, strategies including empowering clients and communities, investigating systematic forms of inequity, and creating space for new cultural learning will become priority in the work that we do as counselors who use assessment. And you as a clinician can attend counseling education credit seminars or continuing education credit seminars to stay up to date on social justice practices so that you know how the society is moving around this expanding demographic within the assessment field. You can specifically use these training opportunities to learn more. We also see that there are changes in terms of globalization and problematization. So globalization is defined as the process of interacting with various societies across the world. It is expected that globalization will continue to influence the process of assessment. As counselors engage with international counselors and conduct counseling in international settings, the way in which counseling is conceptualized in practice will change to better meet the needs of the client. So as this globalization and this contact with clinicians and with clients all across the world continues expanding with the inventions and utilizations of telehealth, we as counselors are also going to expand the way that we conceptualize counseling and the way that we practice counseling to best meet the needs of our client. And problematization refers to counselors questioning the assumptions about both the practice of counseling and assessment. And this can include things like dismantling constructs and current assessment methods and contact. This process of problematization will lead to changes in assessment, including new constructs to be named and items to be developed for these constructs, new methods for collecting data for decision making and client self-awareness, and innovative ways of selecting, administering, interpreting, and reporting assessment tools and their findings. So this problematization really gives us the framework for being able to question the status quo of what assessment has been doing so far. And it's through this questioning that we really start to dismantle some of the previous systems within assessment that have been oppressive in various circumstances. And by questioning them, we can start moving in a direction that allows assessment, the entire process of assessment, especially assessment in counseling, to be used in a more equitable and valid way with our clients. And as we become a globalized society that challenges the way that we have been traditionally doing, or challenge the ways that things have been traditionally done in counseling and assessments, counselors may integrate what research calls the 4 R's of Indigenous ways of knowing. And those 4 R's include relational accountability or responsibility, which is the awareness that ways of knowing are based on the relationships between all life forms. So focusing on how the ways that we know and how to exist in the world is heavily influenced by the way that we are in relation to everything in our world. The people, the places, the things, ourselves, all of that comes into play. We also have respect, which is the notion that humility, active involvement, and shared knowledge should be valued in the ways that we know and experience the world. There's also the R for reciprocity, which stands for the give and take of shared power between an individual and an Indigenous group. So allowing for that balance of the power relationship because it is quite exaggerated in an assessment process. And the final R is the rights and regulations, which refers to the development and adherence to Indigenous protocols to achieve jointly created goals in the work that we as clinicians do. So again, this is a research finding that says as our society continues diversifying, we continue challenging the status quo of assessment, we might expand the ways that we know information and the way that we approach information. And this is one example of how. We also see that technology is changing still to this day, and even probably more today than it did 10 years ago, but increased technology in the future will allow counselors to engage in more accurate, efficient, and contextualized assessment processes, whether that is conducting assessments completely virtually or just utilizing technology in the assessment room. So some of the technology aids that we might see continuing to inform the assessment process could be things like computers, tablets, avatars and virtual reality systems, biofeedback measures, and neuroimaging equipment, as well as social media. We expect to see all of these aspects of technology and advances in each of these areas to come into play on the utilization of assessment in the work that we do. In fact, I think it's really cool that there are agencies, even here in Fort Collins, that rely almost exclusively on tablet-based assessments. So the clinician comes in and they have two tablets, one that faces the client, one that faces the clinician. And on the clinician's side, the system within the tablets, like there's a specific app that you have to have. But on the clinician side, it shows only the scoring side. And on the client side, it shows only the testing side. And they're connected just by sitting close to each other. And you watch the client go in real time through their assessment and completing the tasks, and you as a clinician get to sit there and score in real time instead of what we do now, which is oftentimes you sit in the room with a client, you test for 3 hours, you leave the room, and you score for another hour and a half depending on the assessment. It's a much faster process, and I think it's really cool that we have an agency here in Fort Collins that already does this tablet-based assessment. So we absolutely expect these advances in technology to continue changing the way that we do assessment. And we also see that there's hopefully an evolving sophistication of assessment in general. Because as the assessment process becomes more sophisticated, there will be increases in the uses of formative assessments, which are these assessments that measure constructs of interest at various points in a client's life to inform ongoing treatment and other forms of decision making. So the formative assessment is this ongoing assessment process that can increase and decrease over time as you work with a client. And it's not viewing a client as, oh, I'm only going to assess you at this one time and this is who you are and this is what I know to be true about you. This formative assessment takes a much more comprehensive approach. We also see that there will also be an increased use of assessments of learning and other metacognitive processes to show how people learn as well as what they learn. Right now, we have some of these assessments, and the primary one that we've already talked about is dynamic testing, where you are introducing someone to this learning and instruction that you are looking at how do they use that information. Are they able to problem solve and learn from the information that you give them? And are they able to induce these feedback loops? And these increased assessments on learning and other metacognitive processes really give us an opportunity to better understand the process of learning and instruction. And we expect that to increase in the future. So we expect to see more dynamic assessments as our assessment procedures continue evolving. It's also important for counselors to develop assessment tools that approximate real life experiences or have what we call ecological validity. And this ecological validity is to say that whatever assessment you're using is going to relate to what the client's doing in their real life, on their day-to-day, and what they're doing when they leave the office. And this increased sort of focus on ecological validity will facilitate client engagement as well as increasing the meaningfulness of assessment findings. If you can find a way to continue applying an assessment to the client's existence and what they're doing in their day-to-day, they're going to match better with the content that you're giving them. They're going to pay attention more, they're going to remember it better, and they're going to make changes faster. And we also see that in the future, assessments will likely be focused on an area's strengths and other areas of non-pathology. And we expect this to continue increasing because a lot of times historically, especially at the very beginning of assessment was used to identify dysfunction and quote unquote abnormalities. And we really see this focus as we continue progressing in the assessment field towards using assessment to identify strengths as well as other areas of functioning in a client's life and not necessarily areas of pathology. And finally, we would expect that the use of qualitative assessments will receive greater attention as their own independent tools and as supplemental tools to other traditional quantitative assessments. So, as the field continues changing, we would expect to see this use of qualitative measures to also expand. And we would expect that there will be continued increased public demand for educational accountability. And as counselors of the future, they will need to be aware of the most up to date accountability legislation, as well as support their educational partners with its implementation. So, an example of that is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the successor of the No Child Left Behind Act that aims to maximize student opportunity by creating additional support for quote unquote disadvantaged schools while also building opportunities such as preschool access, college and career readiness, as well as wraparound services. So we would see as the field of assessment continues adapting, we're going to see that assessors are going to have to be part of the people who help support educational partners who are navigating and managing the output of laws like Every Student Succeeds Act. We also see that the Gordon Commission of Future Assessment in Education has called for innovation in examining the processes and outcomes of teaching and learning. And with changes in ability testing and other classroom-based measures, students and those individuals who teach them could potentially benefit from studying how students learn the best, which then brings in the role of assessors in being able to identify and present information about how students learn the best way and how to make that work in the classroom for those students. And overall, with more flexibility in demonstrating educational accountability, counselors and assessors will increasingly collaborate with education professionals across the board. And that's what we would expect as the field of assessment continues changing. So that's where we're going to wrap up this first part of our lecture on Chapter 1. Join me for the second part of our lecture, not on Chapter 1, my goodness, this is part 1 of our lecture on Chapter 16. Join me for the next part of the lecture where we're going to continue talking about trends in counseling, assessment, as well as the future. I will see you all in the next lecture.